Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Morrow Public Speaking Presentations, Vienna Live with Simeon Morrow, and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your microphone and camera and/or go to the LinkedIn live video feed, the link to which I will now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by asking questions and making comments. To do so, please either write in the chat room, raise your hand, or turn on your microphone and say hi, and I'll be delighted to include your perspective in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guest is Cheryl Frazes Hill, a conductor and author of Margaret Hillis, Unsung Pioneer, the presentation of which is the subject of tonight's show. Cheryl is joined by Frank Villella, a singer and director of the Rosenthal Archives of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Association. We are also pleased to be joined by Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Cheryl, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do as a musician, some of your many, many activities, please?
Well, like every other working musician, I wear a lot of hats. I am the director of the Milwaukee Symphony Chorus. I am the interim director and associate conductor of the Chicago Symphony Chorus. Recently, professor emeritus of the Chicago College of Performing Arts at Roosevelt University. And I was mentored by Margaret Hillis, who appointed me to the conducting staff of the Chicago Symphony Chorus way back in the late 1980s.
Okay, wow. Frank, hi, welcome. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do as director of the Rosenthal Archives of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Association?
Certainly. Thank you, Simeon. A pleasure to be here in the early afternoon here in Chicago, of course, in the evening, I guess, in Vienna. As the archivist of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Association, I'm responsible for all of the materials that document the history of the association. Of course, that includes the orchestra, the chorus, the building, etc. And those materials include correspondence, contracts, photographs, recordings, artifacts, etc. So I'm responsible for the preservation of those materials, but also providing access to those materials to researchers, patrons, musicians, etc. I also, like you said, I also work as a singer, and I was a member of the Chicago Symphony Chorus for 20 seasons. I auditioned for the chorus just as I was graduating from DePaul with a degree in vocal performance, and Margaret Hillis hired me. So my first 2 years in the chorus were her last 2 as the director. And it was actually at a chorus rehearsal that I saw a posting on a bulletin board about a job here in the archives. So I credit Miss Hillis and being a member of the chorus with, getting my job here in the archives. And in May of this year, I will celebrate 30 years here in the archives, which doesn't seem possible.
Congratulations. So Cheryl, tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book. Clearly, Margaret Hillis was a very important figure in your life, but not so many students of great conductors, of great people, end up writing a biography of their mentors. Tell us, why did you write this book?
Well,
because I forced her to.
I have to defer to Frank on this. He invited me to the Rosenthal Archives in Chicago Symphony Center. What seems like an eternity ago, it was 10 years ago about now.
Yep.
And to discuss the possibility of me considering writing a book about Margaret Hillis. I'd never written a book about anything. I'd written a lot of scholarly articles and so forth. But he informed me that her centennial anniversary of her birth was coming up in 2021. Well, that seemed like light years from that. Then when we conversed about this, I couldn't imagine why he was asking me something that seemed like it was just an eternity from when we were talking about it. Little did I know it would take 8 years for me to write this book. Frank, would you care to add to that story?
Yeah, the thing is, we worked on several, here in the archives, I've worked on several book and exhibit projects and whatnot, and it always takes longer than you think it does. And even though these anniversaries seem so far on the horizon, they will be here before you know it. So for projects like this, it's always best to start as far in advance as possible. And what's that physics law? As long that a gas will expand to whatever space it's given, however much time you have to do this project, that's how much time it will take. So even though it was about 8 years out from when we first had a conversation, that's how long it took, but we got the job done.
Well, you know, when you talk about a project like this, and Frank will talk later about the archival collection that he was able to obtain for the archives, there was such a tremendous amount of material that was Margaret Hillis's, all of her records of her contracts and letters. You know, there was no internet at the time, so any communications you had were on paper. All of that, and all of her music, and just so many personal effects. That took 2 years to go through. And once that was gone through the first time, I had to go back and look at it again, because then I was starting to realize what I had just been through. And then you start interviewing people. And then what's the story? And of course, having jobs and being a parent and all the other things, all the other hats, as I referred to, this takes a process. And actually, it took a lot of time to figure out what her story really was. So Frank was very wise to alert me to this and to give me the kind of time that allowed me to let this progress in a kind of a very organic way.
And one of the other challenges with such an expansive story, which is Margaret Hillis, is not just deciding what to write about, but deciding what not to write about, and what to actually exclude from the book, which is, you know, still might be interesting, but might not be along the path of the story that you decided to tell.
Right. I will just add that Philip Husher, who is our wonderful musicologist at what is his title, Frank?
Program annotator.
Program annotator, and he's writing a book right now about the history of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and he wisely counseled me in his in some of our commiserations about writing a book. He said, just because it happened doesn't mean you need to write about it. What a great piece of advice that was, because there are a lot of very interesting tidbits, as Frank said, but they don't all belong in this story.
Okay, so that brings us to our first roundtable. The most important information for those of us who are not acquainted with this, with Margaret Hillis. Who was she? She was born October 1st, 1921, and passed on February 5th, 1998. Cheryl?
Well, we have some nice slides and things to share with you from the archives that I think will help even make this story just a little bit more interesting. Of course, Margaret Hillis was the founder and the first director of the Chicago Symphony Chorus, 1957 and 1994. And that's really what most people know her for. She developed one of the top ensembles of its kind in the world. And this is a picture from, I think, Frank, you can say again what the history of this picture was.
Sure. This is actually the first image of the chorus on stage with the orchestra. This is in March 1959. So just barely 2 years after the chorus's, 1 year after the chorus's first performance, about 1.5 years after its founding. This is right before or right after a performance of Prokofiev's Alexander Nevsky, which was actually also the first recording that the chorus appeared on, performing it in English, actually. And that's, you can see Miss Hillis in a white dress right at the skirt of the stage. Right there in the center is, of course, Fritz Reiner, our music director at the time, and his assistant, Walter Hendel, is to his left, to our right. So yeah, full orchestra, full chorus on stage. And I know of two members of the chorus who are still very much with us, who are in this photograph.
Amazing story. Frank, I'll actually turn this over to you for a minute because, as I said, this was Margaret Hillis's legacy that most people would know it if they know her at all. And most recognizably in Chicago, this is what she's known for. We're going to talk later about all the things she was not recognized for that I'm hoping the book will illuminate.
So the chorus's accomplishments, that section?
Yeah.
Got it. So actually, about a year after this photograph was taken, the chorus first appeared at the Ravinia Festival under Walter Handel, performance of Mahler's Second Symphony, The Resurrection. The chorus first appeared with the orchestra at Carnegie Hall in 1967 under the baton of then music director Jean Martineau. Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, and that Henze piece, oh, I can't remember the name of it, but I remember it's a piece by Henze. After that, of course, several years later, the chorus first traveled with the orchestra to Europe in 1989 for performances of Berlioz's The Damnation of Faust at the Salzburg Festival and the Proms in London. I mentioned that this image right here is during the time when the chorus first recorded with the orchestra. Since then, of course, the chorus made about 50 recordings with the CSO under Hillis's direction, and 9 of those recordings won Grammy Awards for Best Choral Performance. So the recording jackets are listed, you can see them on the left there, and the actual Grammy Awards, which were part of the Hillis collection, which are in the vault here at Symphony Center, are pictured at the right. And also the recording of the Berlioz Damnation of Faust also won a Grand Prix du Disque, which is an award given in France. To the best of my knowledge, the Chicago Symphony Chorus currently is the largest unionized chorus in the United States. It currently has 170 professional members on the roster. And like I said, to the best of my knowledge, please don't quote me on this, it is the largest chorus of its kind in the United States. And in addition to the CSO, the chorus has also performed with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Israel and the Berlin Philharmonics, and also in the recording studio, it has participated in 2 movie soundtracks with the CSO, Fantasia 2000, which was recorded in the mid to late 1990s, and the soundtrack to Lincoln, the Steven Spielberg film that was recorded in May of 2012. And
Frank, forgive me, did you mention the White House, the Correspondents' Dinner?
Oh, I did not. Thank you. So another notable performance during the Jimmy Carter administration, the chorus was, members of the chorus were invited to sing at the White House under Hillis's direction, and that would have been in the late 1970s.
Correct. So, Frank, I think I'm going to go on and talk about other things that she accomplished. You know, like I said, Margaret Hillis was known for Chicago Symphony Chorus and all of her accomplishments, but really what she did, and it's one of the reasons I was so happy to write the book, is that she raised the quality of choral ensembles. They were truly amateur organizations at the time that she embarked in her profession. Orchestras had trained musicians, trained instrumentalists. They were trained on their instrument. They were trained musically speaking, but choruses at that time, we're talking late 40s, early 50s, were mostly volunteer organizations that were, and the volunteer has nothing to do with it. It's the fact that they were not trained singers. Most of them were not trained singers or trained musicians. And so one of the things Margaret Hillis taught herself to do and then disseminated was, how do you take a group of people who are not trained and raise them to the level that they can perform with an orchestra at this professional level? She developed the methods for that, how she studied scores, how she rehearsed choruses. And this information not only was worthwhile for anybody trying to start a symphony chorus, this stuff was transferable to any level of choral conductor. We're talking directors of children's choruses, public school choruses, university choruses, community choruses, up until this the symphonic choruses. Not only did she develop those methods, but then she dedicated herself to actually spreading the word, because it wasn't going to do her any good if she was the only one that was getting to be good at this. She wanted other people to know how she did this. And so she founded the first choral organization that disseminated information, scholarly writings, quality repertoire, resources to find more about a piece of music. She created conducting workshops. There weren't any of its kind that trained choral conductors to work with orchestras. So this was something that she developed. Then she advocated for paying singers a respectable wage so that they would want to sing in ensembles and not just develop their own orchestral or opera careers. And then not only did she, and the way she advocated for paying singers was she got onto the National Endowment for the Arts, and she worked right under the President of the United States and all of that governed these National Endowment finances. And then she became a founding member of the Association of Professional Vocal Ensembles. That was an organization that identified worthy choruses throughout the United States that should receive funding for the National Endowment. So she sat on the National Endowment, and then she sat on the APVE. And so it was much more efficient to get money to choruses that were worthy of receiving funds. Finally, and not least importantly, but equally importantly, she broke the glass ceiling for women conductors. Women were not seen on a podium, were not welcomed on a podium. She was the first woman to have a regular subscription series for a major symphony orchestra in the United States, Chicago. And she was a frequent guest conductor throughout the United States after one pivotal event that we're going to be talking about later, where every orchestra in the country was vying for her because here's a woman that can conduct and she must be good. So she really broke that glass ceiling as well.
Okay. So this brings us then to our second roundtable. How did Hillis achieve her goals being a woman in what was considered a man's profession?
Well, there you go. That's the real story, isn't it? She wanted always, from the time she could remember, to become an orchestral conductor. And this was a field where women were not welcome. She was a lesbian, which would have completely derailed her if any facet of a professional career had this fact ever come out. And then on top of it, what helped her then was that the fact that she came from a very prestigious family, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, where she was raised to believe that she could do anything she set her mind to. So more pictures that I think that I can share with you that will add to the story. My book goes into great detail about the unbelievable challenges that she faced with this pipe dream of wanting to become an orchestral conductor. Yet the story is really relatable to any of us because it's really a story about resilience. It's a story about resourcefulness. It's a story about grit in the face of adversity and the example that she set. So let me give you a little idea of who she was and how her life came about. Let me go back to my... Okay, so we're going to take this to her grandfather. Her grandfather was Elwood Haynes, and he was a very renowned inventor of his time. And one of the first inventions he developed was the first mechanically successful automobile. It actually is one of very few cars that's in the Smithsonian. So he was renowned in Kokomo, Indiana. This was the Haynes Hillis family was considered a very important family. As a matter of fact, they erected and actually, let me put this on. Sorry. So this is a museum that sits in Kokomo, Indiana. This was actually her grandparents' house. And it became, her grandmother deeded it to Kokomo, and it became the Elwood Haynes Museum. In addition to inventing the automobile, he invented stellite, which was the most important ally for stainless steel. And that was what really set the family into a very wealthy situation and really helped fund all of the things that Margaret Hillis was able to do in her life. But again, high visibility family of great accomplishment, including Margaret's mother, Bernice is how you pronounce her mother's name, who received a degree in chemistry way back when women were absolutely not commonly found in universities, and certainly not in chemistry. But you know, her grandfather was a chemist, so Bernice's father was a chemist, and she assisted him in many of his inventions. But this family was really raised to believe they could do anything. The gentleman on the right of Margaret Hillis is Bud Hillis, Elwood Hillis. He's still here, still with us. He was a United States congressman for many years representing Indiana, the state of Indiana, and on we could go. So they were raised to believe they could do anything. And of course, as I said, Margaret Hillis was, from the time she could remember, wanted to be a conductor. And she therefore immersed herself in music from the time she was a child. She studied piano, and she would tell the story about how when she was in music classes as a child, when the teacher would walk out of the room or wasn't looking, she would exchange instruments with her peers to try to learn how to play every instrument in the orchestra and in the band. She knew how to play everything. She was fascinated by it all. So by the time she went to college and she had studied theory, she became a piano major at Indiana University. And and by the way, even though she was a piano major, she played string bass in the orchestra. She just wanted to know everything she could about orchestras because, of course, she was going to become an orchestra conductor. And in the middle of her work at Indiana University, World War II broke out. Margaret and her family were all flyers. They were all pilots, and they were all fascinated by flying. And Margaret Hillis wanted to become a fighter pilot for World War II. She did not have 20/20 vision. And so she, again, this is the story of her life. When somebody told her no, she went, "Oh, I can't do that. Okay, I'm going to do this." She decided to instead become a naval flight instructor. And this is a picture of her at Indiana's Muncie Airport in 1942. As you see, she was the only instructor who was female. And she completed her work. And there are great stories in the book about some disasters of some of the students that she was teaching and things that happened while she was in flight with some of these students. Just unbelievable stories. In any case, she goes back to Indiana, completes her degree, and shares with one of her beloved professors she's going to become a conductor, an orchestra conductor. And he said, "If you do that, you're likely to fail." He says, "If you really are set on becoming a conductor, go through the back door and study choral conducting." Well, she said she was just devastated. First of all, she knew nothing about choral conducting. She knew nothing about chorus. She'd been in instrumental ensembles her whole life. That's all she knew. That's the repertoire she knew. But she wanted to be a conductor. So she thought, okay, I'll do that. And he insisted that she go and study with a gentleman by the name of Robert Shaw, who was the foremost choral conductor in the United States at that time. He was the one that was starting to professionalize choral singing, and he was the only one of its kind. So she went to Juilliard and worked with him, and for 2 years and was very excited to learn about choral conducting. And after 2 years, she thought, I get it. I know what I'm doing. And she leaves Juilliard and starts her own chorus. This is the New York Concert Choir. And how does she start it? She hires a bunch of professional singers, some of whom were actually in Robert Shaw's collegiate chorale. And she paid with her own money, because she was independently wealthy, to get these really fine singers. And she started figuring out, how do you make this chorus sound as precise and as refined as an orchestra? Well, she achieved it. And she was gaining a great reputation in New York City. She actually took her money and rented out Town Hall for a series of concerts, hired with her own money a professional orchestra, and did these marvelous concerts at Town Hall, was building a reputation. Lo and behold, Fritz Reiner, the conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, comes to New York. He cannot find a chorus in Chicago that can sing at the level of his orchestra, and he comes looking for a refined chorus in New York. Comes to New York, hears about Margaret Hillis's chorus, auditions them. Great story in the book about all of the things that happened in that audition, and
also all of the
yes.
things that happened in Chicago that led to him
Yes.
deciding to go to New York, some scheduling
Yes.
snafus at local unnamed universities.
Exactly. And so now he hires them, and they go to Chicago, and they're a hit. They sing in Chicago in 1955, and they come back yet another time. And then there's another phone call about bringing New York back, and Margaret Hillis is so busy with her chorus in New York, they don't have time. And they call a fourth time. And by the fourth time, they're asking for a huge chorus to fly to Chicago. And Margaret Hillis says, look, if you've got that kind of money to fly an entire chorus of that size to Chicago, why don't you start your own chorus? And Fritz Reiner says, good idea, but only if you conduct it. And then there's more great stories about how she decides how she's going to do that because she's living in New York. Well, lo and behold, she does start the Chicago Symphony Chorus. And this is the first program from 1958 when they sing Mozart Requiem with Bruno Walter. I turn it over to Frank because the story gets better.
Yeah, and just a couple of weeks after this, so for this first performance in March of 1958, it was actually Bruno Walter conducting. Bruno Walter was a beloved guest conductor, and for one, I believe this was his final appearance as a guest conductor, so they wanted to make it special. So Fritz Reiner actually very generously gave Bruno Walter the privilege of introducing the Chicago Symphony Chorus to Chicago audiences. But about a month after that, they did the Verdi Requiem, which was the piece that Cheryl was the logistics Cheryl was just describing. In order to do the Verdi Requiem, of course, you need a huge chorus. And instead of spending the money to fly the people in from New York, of course, that was the impetus to start the chorus here. So I mentioned, before the accomplishments that happened soon after this, but the big story we want to tell, the thing that really put the chorus and Hillis on the map, is something that happened about nearly 20 years after this. So in the fall of 1977, the chorus started rehearsing Mahler's Eighth Symphony with, Hillis, of course, preparing the ensemble for that. And for those of you who aren't aware, Mahler's Eighth Symphony is one of the biggest, craziest, wackiest pieces in the repertoire. It has a double chorus, a double adult chorus, plus a children's chorus, plus 8 soloists. The orchestra is expanded. Of course, you need extra horns, et cetera, et cetera. Mahler, of course, called it the Symphony of 1,000 because ideally he wanted about 200 in the orchestra and about 800 in the chorus. When the orchestra first did the piece, it was the Midwestern premiere in 1917. We have a magnificent photo. It's unfortunately not a part of our slide presentation here today, but a magnificent photo. We actually had to perform it in the auditorium theater. Orchestra hall stage wasn't big enough, but we had 978 people on stage. So that just gives you an idea of the scope of this piece. But for the performances in the fall of 1977, Sir George Schulte, our music director at the time, we had an expanded chorus, expanded orchestra, not quite 1,000 people, but 3 performances were scheduled in Orchestra Hall, and then 2 days later, a 4th performance in Carnegie Hall in New York City. So Hillis had been preparing the chorus for about a month and a half. We have her study charts, which indicate exactly what's rehearsed at exactly what moment of exactly which evening, et cetera. So the first 2 performances, so Hillis prepares the chorus, attends all of the rehearsals with the orchestra, performance on Thursday evening, Friday evening, big hit, excellent reviews, standing ovations, et cetera. On Saturday morning, Sir George and his lovely wife, Lady Valerie Schulte, were at their hotel, going from their room down to breakfast. But when the elevator that they were on, when it arrived at the floor where they were exiting, the elevator and the floor didn't quite match up. And so when Sir George exited the elevator, he tripped and fell and landed on his right shoulder and his right elbow. Of course, that's his conducting arm. And he actually ended up in the hospital in a tremendous amount of pain. And with that kind of injury, of course, there's no way he could conduct anything, let alone Mahler's Eighth Symphony that evening. So Hillis arrives at Orchestra Hall probably in the early afternoon, maybe to do some administrative work. Her only job that evening really is to warm up the chorus and attend the performance. But she is approached by John Edwards, who was then our general manager, and Peter Jonas, who was our artistic administrator. And I can only imagine that they must have had, deer in the headlights looks on their faces, but they asked her, can you conduct Mahler's 8th Symphony tonight, in 4 or 5 hours? And Hillis very wisely said, no, it's too much. It's simply too much. And they said, okay, how about 2 days from now, Monday night in Carnegie Hall? And to that, she said, yes. So the Saturday evening performance was canceled. Cheryl can tell a little more about that in just a second, because she was in the chorus at the time, so she was there. On Sunday, Hillis was able, at Lady Schulte's invitation, Hillis visited Sir George in the hospital and went through her score page by page. We have the score in the collection here. And Schulte gave her, there are markings on every single page that Sir George must have given her. And it's all about what's happening next, what to get ready for. The soprano solo is coming, the kids are coming, in 2 pages. Make sure so-and-so is ready, make sure the soprano gets an extra breath here, make sure the baritone, you push it forward for the baritone here. Et cetera, et cetera. So they traveled to Carnegie Hall on Sunday evening, I believe. There was no, since the orchestra and chorus were regulars at Carnegie Hall, there was no rehearsal time booked on Monday in Carnegie Hall.
We actually had a rehearsal with just the chorus, but I'll talk about that.
Right. But no, there was no rehearsal scheduled for the entire ensemble on stage in Carnegie Hall. And of course, this is before the days of, social media and the internet. So even though Schulte had canceled and Hillis was going to take his place, it hadn't publicly been announced. And there were even members of the orchestra who did not know at the time of the performance who was going to walk out and conduct the performance. So the general manager of Carnegie Hall comes out and says, Sir George is ill, he will not be able to conduct. And of course, there are disappointed sighs in the audience, but then they announce—
Frank, wait, don't share.
Oh, please.
Stop there.
Okay, sure, go ahead, Cheryl.
If you don't
You were
mind,
there.
Yeah, I just want to tell this from the perspective of the
Please.
singers, if you don't mind. So just to just circle back for a minute, in the book, and there's too many stories that we won't have time for tonight, but how Margaret Hillis navigated herself through the second half of the Mahler 8 to learn it. She knew it well enough that she knew the choral entries, but the second half of the Mahler symphony is why she turned it down for Saturday night. And her efficiency of learning scores and how she was able to get herself into a position to be able to conduct that piece in 48 hours is really an astonishing story in and of itself. And there's a lot of detail in the book. But as a chorister, I remember driving downtown and listening to WFMT, our classical radio station, on the way downtown and hearing that the concert was canceled. I'm all dressed up, ready to sing. And I'm like, I don't know anything about that. So I get into Orchestra Hall and we go into the ballroom, which is where we warmed up that day because it's such a tremendously large chorus that the regular rehearsal space did not accommodate us. And there we were all wondering what was going on. And Margaret Hillis walked in. We didn't know if we were going to Carnegie Hall. We didn't know if we had a concert that night. We didn't know anything. And of course, she explained that she had told the powers that be she was not ready to conduct the piece tonight, Saturday night, but if they needed her on Monday, that she'd be ready. We flew out to Carnegie Hall. We had no idea who was conducting. And not until she walked out on the stage for the rehearsal that only the chorus had, did we know this is happening. And of course, we had a very quick rehearsal. And one of the things she said to us is, whatever you do, don't try to help me. I will be fine. You do your job, I'll do mine. She was stoic. And we were quite nervous because we knew the task was just an amazingly difficult one. When we stood on the stage, and again, the audience had no idea, the general manager of Carnegie Hall came out, and it was one of those ladies and gentlemen. And as an audience member, you're just dreading what's coming next because something bad is going to be announced. And they said, Sir George Schulte. And before he could even finish, the whole audience is, oh, they were so disappointed. But miraculously, He then said, in his place, Margaret Hillis, and they didn't finish the sentence about Margaret Hillis, and the place erupted. I get teary-eyed as I tell this story because, and I'm getting choked up, because you have to understand, Margaret Hillis became very well known in New York in those early in the 1950s, and they all knew her. But we, as a chorus, only knew her from Chicago. So when you got that kind of response from the audience, it was almost like the audience was with us on this adventure. It was so exciting, and yet it was so emotional. I remember the very opening of the chorus is a very strong Veni, veni, creator spiritus. Come spirits, right? Come the spirit. And there we were trying to get the sound out because everybody was so choked up, understanding that there was so much emotion that was going on. And of course, for 90 minutes or whatever the length of the piece is, we got through this entire performance, which goes through, I believe, without an intermission. I know without an intermission.
Yep.
And at the end, the audience just leapt to their feet. It was one of the most, I've been with the Chicago Symphony for 46 years, and it is still one of the most amazing memories. But the story is much richer than that. And if you read the book, you'll hear all of the backstories and what was going on in Margaret Hillis's mind during this and tremendously difficult experience. So Frank, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I remember it vividly. It was my second year in the chorus. And actually, Frank, I don't know if you were going to mention this about 1977 and the Grammy. Did you want to talk about that?
Oh yeah, that's coming up.
Such a great year.
Another interesting thing, several of the interviews that Hillis did after, she claims many times to not really remember what happened on stage at Carnegie Hall, because her concentration was so intense. It was all about the music. The piece ended and she wasn't really quite sure exactly where she was. So yeah, the performance in Carnegie Hall was a huge hit, and the next day she was front page news in the New York Times. And Cheryl, if you want to advance the slide.
Oh, that's right. I forgot to do that. That's a picture. I don't know where I am in that picture. I'm in there somewhere, but there's Margaret Hillis, all of the soloists in the front, the entire Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the children's choir in the white robes in the center, chorus 1 on the left, chorus 2 on the right. And it's a cast of 1,000. How many people? Do you remember, Frank?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was in and around. It was in and around 400, but far less than 1,000. But as you can see, the Carnegie Hall stage is not a big one, and choristers and instrumentalists alike are virtually shoulder to shoulder. There's that little path for the conductor to get to and from the stage door, but other than that, it is packed on that stage. But then the other interesting thing to note on the front page of the New York Times, woman steps in for Schulte. We don't even see Hillis's name in the headline until, if you look down on the bottom right, it says continued on page 46. On page 46, we actually get to see an image of Hillis and also her name in the secondary headline. So the big news was not that it was Hillis conducting, but it was a woman conducting, stepping in for Schulte.
I would also like to add that the attention did become very fixed on her. She was on the Today Show. She was on all these. Right. And she kept saying, I really didn't think this had anything to do with me. I was just trying to save my musical family. And that was really, because it was always about the music. For her, it was never about her. And that's one of the great lessons of her life.
And this event was really the thing that put both Hillis and the Chicago Symphony Chorus on the international map. Shortly after this, Hillis started receiving invitations to guest conduct all across the country. The chorus had recorded Verdi's Requiem with Sir George Schulte, Leontine Price, Jose Van Damme, Dame Janet Baker, etc. In the spring of 1977, it was released that fall. And in February of 1978, that was the chorus's first Grammy. So just a couple of months after this performance, the first of nine Grammys.
I should add, this was my first season with the chorus in 1976-77. And in 76-77, we had gone to Carnegie Hall twice. We had recorded Missa Solemnis, Verdi Requiem, and Verdi's 4 sacred pieces. in the fall of my second season, we go to Carnegie Hall, this happens, and then we win our first Grammy. I thought this is how it always went with the Chicago Symphony Chorus. I didn't realize this was not typical, but boy, it was certainly fun.
So to kind of launch off of that, what Cheryl just said, so I joined the chorus in the spring of 1992. I was just finishing up my degree at DePaul. I was as green could be. And the first piece that I actually sang with the chorus was also Mahler's Eighth Symphony at the Ravinia Festival under the baton of then music director James Levine. And we didn't quite have this many people on stage, but again, it was packed. We were also paired with the Milwaukee Symphony Chorus. They also joined us. And the one thing that I do remember is being absolutely scared to death that I was going to sing a wrong note and ruin the performance. But of course, one little voice is needed, but certainly, you know, couldn't ruin the performance. Cheryl, do you want me to start talking about the collection, or?
Let's see,
we just about need to move on to the next roundtable, but maybe tell us a little bit, Frank.
Yeah,
early in my, so I started working here in the archive, started in the chorus 92, started in the archives in 93. Miss Hillis, sorry, I have to call her Miss, in rehearsals, we had to call her Miss Hillis. And to this day, I cannot refer to her as Margaret. I still refer to her as Miss Hillis. But shortly after she retired, when her health was starting to decline, I heard one of my classmates from DePaul was actually her personal assistant. And Tina and I had a gig together, or we saw each other socially or something, and she mentioned that Ms. Hillis was considering sending her collection to Northwestern University. And I think the main reason for that was the fact that the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Archives was not on her radar. The archives was started in 1989. She was contemplating retirement at that point because originally she wanted to retire when Sir George Solti relinquished the position of music director in 1991. Logistically, that didn't quite work out, and she stuck on for a couple of more years. But I just think that the archives here just simply wasn't on her radar. So she didn't know it was an option to give her materials to us. But when I heard that from my friend Tina, I alerted Brenda Nelson Strauss, who was the archivist who started the collection here, who hired me. I alerted her that we have to do something in order to get the collection here. So Brenda went to Martha Gilmer, who was then the artistic administrator, who arranged for a meeting with Brenda and Miss Hillis at her house on Sheridan Road. Brenda was able to tell her about the facility, the collection here, that we have, you know, a chunk of the Fritz Reiner collection, we have the Frederick Stock collection, the Theodore Thomas collection, et cetera, and that Hillis's collection belonged here. This was her artistic home for the majority of her career. Her collection needed to be here. During that meeting, Hillis was convinced, and then that was in 1997, and she died, of course, in February 1998. Later that summer, the family contacted us, and we descended upon her house. There were four of us. Myself, a chorus member, Nancy Pfeiffer, and then two other archivists who were working here at the time. We spent a week at the house, in essence, going through all of her materials that, you know, documented her history as a musician. Nancy and I worked on the scores, and Brenda and Allison worked on the papers. The papers were in remarkable condition because Ms. Hillis virtually had an assistant, hired an assistant, you know, for the bulk of her professional career. So her files were in amazingly good order. Nancy and I identified all of the marked scores, which came to the archives collection, and all of the unmarked scores, which went to the civic and orchestra and chorus libraries here to be used because they were in perfectly good condition. So the collection came to us in 1998. A few years later, we actually had the time to start processing and cataloging this huge volume of materials. The scores alone, it's about 1,000 titles, scores and parts. So we were able to start processing and cataloging. Two of the catalogers were interns. One of the cataloger was actually a former chorus member, Jim Yarbrough, who was just an amazing asset to have during that process. And by the time we finished the cataloging of that is, of course, when I approached Cheryl about writing the book.
Without those archives, the story could not have been as rich and nor as revealing about her, because as much as I did know about her, most of us didn't know her. She was a very elusive character as a professional, from one professional to the next. Even as close as our working relationship was, there was so much I learned about her that I could never have known without those archives. I wonder how people are going to do it now with internet. There's not a lot of paper communications, and the stories in the letters, I mean, letters to Ned Rorem, letters from Ned Rorem, her work with Stravinsky in New York, and her collaboration with Samuel Barber, with Aaron Copland, with Leonard Bernstein. There's just so many interpersonal connections that she had, so many fights for a reasonable wage as a conductor, where she would ask for a certain fee and not get it. I mean, all of that is revealed, and letters to and from her brothers, and letters to and from her mother. And there's just so much in there that is just a rich, and by the way, as a conductor, and Frank, by the way, would you please pull the Elijah score for me when you get a chance? I'm always looking at those scores to get an idea of markings, to know, how, getting some good ideas for rehearsal. I'm always using them, and I know many people come into the archives. Margaret continues to teach us. So I know
it's the most frequently accessed collection that we have.
Wow.
Okay.
Well, I know we need to move on to talking about this next area of her life, so I'll let you, Simeon.
Absolutely. So this is our final roundtable for tonight, which is, how are Margaret Hillis' struggles, how can they be put into context? What is it like? What was it like then? And what is it like today to be a woman conductor?
Well, I like to, I was a participant in Breaking Barriers. It was a wonderful festival. It was done at Ravinia this past summer. And the focus was on how women break the barriers as conductors. And they're going to continue with this festival. This actually started as a way of commemorating Margaret Hillis, and it launched into this wonderful festival that will now be annual. But revealed in that festival was the fact that women conductors, and not until 2007, was there a female head of a major American orchestra, and that was Marin Alsop in 2007 with the Baltimore Symphony. Another statistic is from 2007 until 2021, when Marin stepped down, there was not another female music director. And when she stepped down in 2022, just recently, another female United States music director was appointed to the Atlanta Symphony, and she still remains the only one in the United States. So how far are we? And yet I have to say that Margaret Hillis has still come a long way and helped us come a long way. I'm going to show you a few photos that I think will illuminate the situation. This is a conductor, Ethel Laginska. She was very controversial in her time. But this is the kind, on the right is a cartoon of her. This is the kind of publicity women got as conductors. They made fun of how she dressed, how she moved, her facial expression, her body language. And this was the way that women were put down when they actually got as far as being able to get on a podium. I'm afraid that not much changed even in 1945, when somebody like Sir Thomas Beecham would make the comment I do not like and never will the association of men and women in orchestras and other combinations. And then he claims that one of his orchestra members said to him, if she's attractive, I can't play with her. And if she is not, I won't. So this is 1945. And it doesn't get much better in, sorry, I need to advance this slide. It doesn't get much better in 1976. This is Antonia Brico. On the left is a young picture of her. On the right is the picture of her that they had from 1976, claiming that when she was 30 and sexually attractive, she struggled to have a career. And now 72, craggy-faced and sensibly shoed, she now has a career. So this is the kind of PR that women were getting. And I would venture to guess that if you looked at these pictures without the names and the dates, you'd have a hard time identifying them. And some of these women, and many of these women, accomplished a great deal. But the one on the right, upper right, Sylvia Kadoof, 1937. Maren Alsop and I had a conversation about this when I handed her my book a year ago, and she was mentioning Sylvia Kadoof. I said, Maren, I had no idea who this person was. And Maren Alsop said, you know, I didn't know about her either. And she was, on top of studying with Herbert von Karajan and getting incredible recommendations from von Karajan. She conducted the Berlin Philharmonic. She assisted Leonard Bernstein, and yet none of us had heard of her. So the whole idea of this is that most importantly, we need to remember and treasure our legendary women and all of the barriers that they have broken to enable this to be happening, and to be cautious about the things that continue in maybe insidious ways or in ways people aren't aware of, putting down women who want to be in this position of leadership. That's one of the main draws of the book.
Frank, and can you comment a little bit on this with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra? With what is the place of a woman conductor? Why are women not welcomed as conductors? Do they conduct differently? Are they not able to conduct certain repertoire or to impart certain directions? Why do you think that is?
That's a very loaded question, but I don't, having worked as a musician under both men and women conductors, there's no difference. There's absolutely no difference in my eyes. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra doesn't, like most orchestras, doesn't have the greatest track record with hiring women. Of course, Margaret Hillis was the first to conduct the CSO back in 1958, but up until the last couple of years, we haven't had a lot of women on the podium. Just this year, for example, we've had a lovely parade of women, but still it doesn't come near to equity with the men. Just a couple of weeks ago, Zhang Zhang was on the podium. Sorry, I'm using my little cheat sheet over here. Last fall, Dalia Stasevska was here. Anna Rakatina was here last summer at Ravinia. Jerry Lynn Johnson became the second African-American woman to conduct the orchestra. The first one was Margaret Harris back in the 1970s, who made a fantastic debut here, but then was not invited back. Dame Jane Glover, of course, in the last year. Karina Kanalakis made a spectacular appearance last spring doing Strauss's Ein Heldenleben. Then, of course, Maren Alsop was just here last week doing a program of all women composers, which was, I went twice. It was that good. And of course, you know, she is currently the I can't remember her exact title, but she's artistic curator at the Ravinia Festival currently for the next couple of years. It's the same thing as being music director of the festival. But we've come a long way in a short period of time, but we still have a tremendous distance to go for there to be equity.
Okay, and I'd like to note that Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California, he wrote that he would like to remind everybody about Joanne Falletta of the Buffalo Philharmonic. He said she was
actually interviewed. She was actually interviewed for the book. She was one of the first people I talked to.
Fantastic. And so before we get to our final question, then maybe Cheryl, you can say, why do you think that is? I mean, going back to what I asked Frank, so you and Frank are at the very top of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and I imagine if you're at the top of this administration, you know, why is it that we still have this situation then? Is it the audience who don't want to see women conductors? What's standing in the way then, since, as you've shown us this whole hour, that we had such, they've been so successful at conducting, they've been so influential on making the Chicago Symphony a household name all over the world?
Yeah, it's a very hard question for me to answer. Being a female, you know, I just think people are grow accustomed to certain things being a certain way. I don't know that it's necessarily a bias at this point that women can't do it. I think people have a comfort zone, and it, we're trying to change that slowly but surely. And I think the more that people get used to seeing this. One of the things that was said in Breaking Barriers is, unlike women in business, where there are so many businesses where women can have a chance to become CEOs, there aren't that many symphony orchestras. And so, and the other thing is, it's really hard to practice becoming a conductor of an orchestra. You can't take an orchestra home and practice. With business, you can grow and move up the ladder and learn some of these skills. But having a symphony take a chance on somebody that hasn't had that much experience, or that they haven't seen, these are big asks. I understand. I think it's a very hard, change comes hard. And I think for this music business, it comes I think we're a little bit slower than some of the other professions.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, on the administrative side, though, I mean, we do have more than half of the staff, more than half of the administrative staff here is there's a greater ratio of women to men. And even in our senior management, on the vice president level, the majority of the vice presidents here are women. We've had 2, women executive directors, once in the 1890s, believe it or not. And then of course, Deborah Rutter, who went on to the Kennedy Center just a couple of years ago. So on the administrative side, there is equity. But just on the performance side, not quite yet. As far as soloists are concerned, for example, we have almost just as many women, coming as soloists. But as far as rostered currently in the orchestra, it's about 60% male, 40% female. We've never quite gotten to the 50% level there.
When I started in 1976, I think Melanie and there were maybe 2 other women. Yeah. Maybe Lynn Turner Singer on harp, Melanie in violin, and
Joyce No.
Yeah, so 3 women were in the orchestra when I started, and so that's been a seismic change. And women who are percussionists and brass players, these are things that took a while for the world to accept.
The chorus has always been 50-50, though.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have an inspiring tale and an inspiring book to help us keep moving in that direction and bringing in these incredible talents that I imagine, unfortunately, were not present before. So now we have a greater every day then with the incredible work that you 2 have been doing, a greater possibility of hearing those voices that will inspire us. So last question, Frank, first to you and then to Cheryl. If Margaret Hillis was here today with us, what would you say to her?
Well, to be completely honest, I never directly spoke with Margaret Hillis. So that if that were to happen, that would be a first. I of course, rehearsed under her. I auditioned for her, and at my first audition, the thing that I remember the most is that she was sitting at a table, and underneath the table, lying on her feet, was her dog. So that was kind of the atmosphere. The atmosphere of the audition actually was quite relaxed, and she was very welcoming. But I never spoke to her directly. I guess the thing that I would say, I would want her to know what a privilege it is to be the gatekeeper of her collection. I feel a tremendous responsibility, a tremendous ownership of that because of my personal connection to it on many levels. And so I would just want to let her know what a privilege it is to be in this position.
Okay, Cheryl.
Well, I thought about this after we spoke about this yesterday. I think I would thank her for all that she's done for choral music, for singers, for women conductors, but I think most importantly, for being a role model for conductors. It was never about her. It was always about the music. She served the music and her ensembles by treating everybody with great dignity, great respect, and by always being thoroughly prepared. I thought she was just a great example for all of us to follow. And there are many stories about this kind of thing in the book. I hope everybody has a chance to read it.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see how we can stay in touch with Cheryl. Excuse me, how we can buy the book. Here's the book. There it is, Margaret Hillis, Unsung Pioneer by Cheryl Frazes Hill, and it's available by Gia Publications. And
also on Amazon?
Or on Amazon. So I will
And also
put
at the Symphony store here in Chicago.
Oh, fantastic. So you can go right down to Symphony Center and buy it there. That's fantastic to know. So there is, I put that in the chat room. And let's see how we can stay in touch with Cheryl. Here is her Chicago Symphony Orchestra biography and contact information. So Cheryl, people can reach out to you by clicking on your name there in red.
That's what I understand.
Fantastic. So reach out to Cheryl with your questions about the book, about whatever, any questions or comments you have. She's there to be in contact with you about your questions. All you have to do is go to this website. It is cso.org about performers, and there it is. I put it in the chat room. So and then we have Frank's over here. Frank, people can reach out to you with any questions they have just by clicking on your name right there.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Questions to me are my job security. So please ask questions.
Fantastic. So Frank is there. He is there for you. All you have to do is you go to the link that I sent you on the Chicago Symphony Orchestra website and click his name right there. So thank you so very much to Cheryl Frazes Hill and to Frank Villella.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at what's coming up next week. Next Wednesday, we have Julio Mendívil, musical violence. Quote, thy magic power binds together again all that custom divides. All men become brothers where your soft wings glides, end quote. Since Beethoven concluded his Symphony No. 9 by setting Schiller's Ode to Joy into a symphonic finale that still today resonates the essence of Western classical music in society, few have even allowed themselves to consider that maybe Western classical music could incarnate violence and hate against men, women, and children. Yet, violence is the Western classical music tradition in the South American Andes, where it represents violence against and humiliation of the continent's indigenous communities, rather than transforming the hearts of European colonizers and bringing them into harmony with native peoples. Western classical music promoted thorough ethnic cleansing, the brutal legacy of which is still vividly on display. University professor Julio Mendívil, chair of ethnomusicology at the University of Vienna, knows that firsthand from his own field research in both South America and in Europe. Come welcome Professor Mendívil to our show, and let's find out just how wrong Beethoven was. That is next Wednesday, Julio Mendívil, musical violence, and all information about upcoming shows may be found at www.simeonmoro.com. Once again, thank you so very much to Cheryl Frazes Hill and Frank Villella. Thank you to Professor Lino Rivera. Thank you to Agnieszka and Benoit Rivolet for their support of this show. Most of all, thanks to you, our participants, who make it all worthwhile. From New London, New Hampshire, and Chicago, Illinois, and the Bay Area, California, goodbye. And
thanks so much, Simeon. A privilege.
Thank you so much, Simeon.